Chapter 11. The issue of the 17th of November of Galignani's Massager contained, among the fate divers, an inconspicuous item that by chance came to the attention of Aymar as he was perusing this sheet, and naturally struck him at once. Tales of wolves depredating Paris are always afloat in times of war. Here is a legend that will not die. The severity of the coming winter, heralded by the recent cold, and the famine that now reigns in our poor city, have again conspired to revive this imperishable legend. In the outlying quarters there is talk of a wolf, some even say droves of wolves, and one informer would have us believe that a specimen wolf was actually secured and taken to the Jardin d'Acclimatation for identification. What happened there is left vague. It is never wise to submit a legend to a scientist like our esteemed A. Geoffrey St. Hilaire. The article provoked a sudden spasm in Aymar. He was at once certain that the story did have a foundation of truth, and that foundation was nothing less than Bertrand. Remote connection indeed, but in the frame of mind he was in, weeks in Paris, with no clue to Bertrand except a series of horrible crimes, which no one but himself ascribed to a wolfman monster, he was capable of seizing upon the slightest clue and finding everything in it, as a microscopist discovers whole populations in a drop of foul water. How should a wolf come into Paris? He asked himself, through the German lines. Ridiculous. Ergo that wolf was our Bertrand. He formed in Paris. Far jump, but no farther than Newton made from the falling apple to the eternally falling moon. Yes, here was a spore, definite and direct. Moreover, the slightest chance was worth investigation. He made up his mind. The famine in Paris, of which the newspaper article spoke, had at this period reached considerable proportions, if we may be allowed to speak of nothingness reaching magnitude. Although the question of feeding Paris had come up at once, upon the opening of hostilities, Paris being almost a frontier city and exposed to the advance of the enemy across a short distance of French territory, nothing much had been done until the night of August 4th to 5th, when the danger became acute. The government had just received a telegram announcing the defeat at Wissembourg. M. Henri Chevreau, who had lately replaced the famous and infamous Haussmann, beautifier of Paris, as prefect of the Seine, gathered together a committee of municipal councillors and functionaries and moved to gather into the city a sufficient supply of foodstuffs, meats, hay and grain for horses, salt, wine, etc. Although the legislative body was repeatedly assured that everything had been done to safeguard Paris from famine during a long siege, and although over 6 weeks elapsed before the city was completely invested, nevertheless a shortage of food and consequent rise in prices declared itself almost at once. Government rationing could not help. The poor took the matter philosophically and intelligently, as they always do. They noticed that every time after an announcement of peace negotiations, false though the announcement might be, food at once reappeared in quantities on the stalls and prices sank. Everyone who was in a position to do so was hoarding food, hoping for greater profits, but partly scared into releasing their hoards upon the prospect of the siege ending suddenly. There were indeed great quantities of food in Paris, but private profit was manipulating the market. The name of Geoffrey St. Hilaire also caught Aymar's attention. St. Hilaire, he said to himself, especially that combination, Geoffrey St. Hilaire. I wonder now, could that be the same fellow I used to know? So, his task was easier. Geoffrey St. Hilaire could not have forgotten him and would extend him every courtesy. It must be the same. The Geoffrey St. Hilaires were always connected with zoology. That very afternoon Aymar betook himself to the office of the director of the Jardin d'Acclimatation. The director was too busy, it seemed. Tell him, said Aymar, that I used to know him when he was never too busy. The clerk returned to the director's office. A moment later, Geoffrey St. Hilaire, grandson of the famous Geoffrey St. Hilaire, the news of whose discoveries had seemed to Goethe more important than the fate of kingdoms, appeared and said hurriedly, Monsieur, as though he wished to expedite matters and return to his work as quickly as possible. Then he hesitated. Tiens, c'est toi, Aymar. They embraced. Et alors? After a few phrases concerning their respective fates, Aymar wished to come to his point. I hear from the newspapers, he said, that a wolf was brought here. The director laughed nervously. A wolf? Oh yes. Ha ha. The newspapers of Course. Then he became quite serious. Are you interested in that wolf? Yes, deeply, Aymar exclaimed. Then struck at his own emotion, he sought to explain. That's precisely why I came. You see, I'll explain. No need, said the director quietly and seriously. My friend, I'm afraid. I see all too well. He hesitated while Aymar shivered. Let me see now, he continued. I'm very busy now, but your visit is most opportune. I'm invited to dinner along with Maubert. Did you know him? Maubert the big. Maubert? No? Well, anyway, he can't come, so you must go with me. Meet me here. In 2 hours. We'll be going to dinner together. Yes, you must meet me here. He concluded hastily. A bit nervously, Aymar thought. But the wolf? Yes, precisely. The wolf, he said mysteriously and slipped back into his office. Aymar, amazed, thrilled, vainly turning over 100 speculations in his mind, returned home to dress and then back to meet his old friend sharp 2 hours later. He knows all, was his thought, but when the director appeared, he certainly gave no sign of it. Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire took Aymar amicably under the arm and led him to the gate where a coach was waiting. They drove off at a good clip. Where to? Aymar asked. To Dr. Anatole de Grandmont. The wolf? Aymar asked. S.H., his friend replied. The trajectory was short. In a few moments they had alighted and entered a fine old house. The dining room, visible beyond the drawing room, was splendidly illuminated. The table set for 10 sparkled with fine china and glassware with silver and gold plate, all set on a snowy cloth. Aymar was introduced. Poor Maubert couldn't come. I've taken the liberty to bring an old friend, M. Aymar Gallies, an old Republican, M. le Docteur Anatole de Grandmont, our host, M. de Caterphages, and M. Richard du Cantal, vice presidents of our society, M. de Maritz, the famous. We know each other, said Aymar. They shook hands. M. de Croix, our celebrated propagandist for the use of horsemeat. Richer, stronger and better for the health, said M. de Croix severely. M. Graux, whose father made sheep grow silk. M. Degent. M. Gerardo. It struck Aymar that there was something about this gathering. It was natural, of course, that they should all be interested in animal husbandry, but there was something else. A constant whispering and chuckling, and in general an import to this meeting which he could not fathom. Once he heard, "You'll go through with it, of course." "I'm afraid I'm weakening rapidly," replied the person thus addressed, finding himself near his friend, Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire, and therefore safe. Aymar spoke up. "About that wolf. You'll learn in time." The director cut him short hastily. Could it be, Aymar wondered, that the whole mystery had been uncovered and that it was this that elicited this buzzing of suppressed excitement? At this moment the host called the company to order. "Gentlemen, your attention please. I see that the purpose of our dinner this evening has not remained as secret as we wished it to be. It little matters. You all know that this is a moment of great danger to our beloved patrie and to our dear city of Paris, the jewel of Europe. Here we are, near 2 million of us, and of food there is a sad lack. Our enemies know it and are depending on this factor to cause our undoing. But God willing, we shall manage to hold out until the provinces gather their forces and come racing to our rescue, under the leadership of our staunch Gambetta. We too have our little work to do. We too can help. We too, gentlemen, have a little plan. It is not an invention that shall blow up armies, it is not a scheme for a sortie en masse, it is none of the plans of our dear Trochu or any other of our brave generals. It is, my dear friends, a contribution of zoological science to mankind. Not only to our stricken city, no, to all the world, at present limited in its choice of foods to a very small number of animals. This is an historic occasion. We shall all have reason to remember it. The world will honor us for this brave step, this bursting of bonds that only silly prejudice has forged and tradition tempered. Gentlemen, let this be a merry occasion. We Columbuses all about to explore a new world, discover a new taste in dishes and a new nourishment in foods. Let this, as I say, be a merry occasion. Have you heard the joke that is taking Paris by storm? It heralds a new era. Let us fling away our old hide bound notions and plunge in with a smile. The joke? Yes, here it is. Our good bourgeois of Paris, hard pressed for a bite to put between his teeth, has sacrificed his dog on the altar of the great god appetite. He and his wife sit in silence and consume their beloved fox terrier. The wife looks up after a while and notices her husband carefully placing the bones beside his dish, even as he had always done. Why, what are you doing? Ah! He catches himself up and sighs. Too bad, he says, shaking his head. Fido certainly would have enjoyed these bones. Though the joke was not new for some of the guests, there was a complimentary burst of laughter and the company filed into the neighboring dining room and took seats. Aymar was beginning to understand. Only beginning. The soup was excellent. The guests kept saying as much again and again, especially M. de Croix, the advocate of horse meat for human food, and the reason was at once plain. No sooner was the course clear than the host announced that the soup was consommé of horse with millet. In came the relèves, the appetizers. More exclamations of delight. The cook was called in to receive congratulations. Aymar, a little muddled, tasted the dishes, found them pleasant and wondered. After some lively discussion between the guests, the host, reading from a slip of paper, announced, "We have had skewer roast of dog's liver, à la maître d'hôtel, and minced back of cat with mayonnaise sauce." Aymar controlled his stomach, but of course it was only a joke. He turned to his friend for assistance, but Geoffrey St. Hilaire was busy making notes on the back of a letter. Came the entrees, which subsequently were revealed as braised shoulder and undercut of dog with tomato sauce, jugged cat with mushrooms, dog cutlet with green peas, venison ragout of rats sauce. Robert. The roast followed, borne in great platters, while Aymar was ready to sink under the table, if his scientific companions had not been so objective in their demeanor, tasting, criticizing, discussing, comparing. He would have given way long ago and collapsed. The roast was leg of dog in raccoon pepper sauce, salad, begonias with dressing and cold-boiled mice, side dish, plum pudding with rum and horse marrow. And still they came, dish after dish. Finally the repast was over. The wise ones had only tasted each food, lest they be gorged. When the company sat back with sated appetites, Geoffrey St. Hilaire was invited to read his report. The soup was excellent. Some found the millet a little hard, but none had anything but praise for the savor. Our repugnance for dog's liver, roasted on skewers, was quickly forgotten. When we had tasted this truly delicious preparation, lamb kidney was held to be its nearest equivalent, but below dog's liver in tenderness. Second helpings were frequent for the minced back of cat. This is white meat, vaguely recalling cold veal, but more pleasant. Recommended for invalids. Braised shoulder and undercut of dog were highly appreciated and judged to be not unlike the flesh of chamois. The jugged cat, though a little tough, was so flavorsome that had not the number of dishes been so large, many would have gladly called for more. Too much vinegar, I believe the other guests will bear me out in this, was used on the dog cutlets. This meat is rather stringy, but not bad. Not a single one of us had a word other than praise for the exquisite ragout of rats. It is only to be compared to the flesh of swallows. The leg of dog is extremely edible, though a bit coarse in texture. The best parts were those least well done, left bloody. Few cared for the raccoon, which was without flavor. The begonia salad was reminiscent of sorrel. I believe we have here an excellent corrective for a too exclusive salted meat diet. This should be investigated. Cold mice are deceptively like prawn meat. Some accused the cook of practicing a trick on us. The great success of the evening remains the ragout of rats. I cannot understand how the world has so long refused this delicious food. For one, am converted. Hereafter, famine or no famine, my menu shall be frequently adorned with rat meat, and my guests will learn to love it as I. Yes, I foresee a great new industry. For once the savage rats are exterminated by our epicures, rats will have to be bred in farms, and breeding will improve them, if indeed one can think of any improvement. From this room let the word go forth to the public. The rat is good food. Do not imagine that one must have many rats to make a meal. A rat skinned and boned leaves nearly 8 ounces of meat, of which 1 ounce is liver, very fat and succulent. 2 rats will take care of a modest family, and 1 trial will convince and convert. A single criticism and a single warning before I conclude. The criticism: our cook did bravely, but he erred in his attempt to conceal a different flavor of meat with heavy sauces. These meats will soon become appreciated for their own peculiar flavor. The warning, which I shall have posted on the walls in our city, rat meat must be boiled before preparation to prevent trichinosis, which has occasionally been observed. The dinner had consumed such a length of time that the guests soon separated. Aymar steeled himself, managed to express effusive thanks for a delightful meal and a rare experience. Geoffrey St. Hilaire sat down amidst a salvo of hand-clapping. Porto was served now in the English style, and Aymar seized his glass and drank eagerly, to quiet his rebelling stomach. Of course, said Geoffrey as soon as they were outside, this is only a beginning. We have not touched the insect world. He expanded his chest with pride and satisfaction. Come, let us walk a bit. The night air is refreshing. Aymar found it so too. Yes, insects. Have you ever tasted a bedbug? Sweet, you know. Bad odor, though. But locusts, like nothing you ever tried. We'll need new terms when we come to that. Yes, man is omnivorous. Zoologists have always classed him and the bear together in this respect. Why then has he been hitherto so timid? When he has but to reach forth his hand. Columbus's old Grandmont struck the right note there. Aymar hesitated to interrupt this almost elegiac flow from the scientist who, for the moment, seemed to be speaking with the gift of prophecy. Shyly he ventured. And the wolf? Then Geoffrey St. Hilaire did a curious thing. He turned toward his companion and, grasping his hand, declared with emotion, I know, my friend. I understand. Let us say no more. What did he understand? Aymar wondered. Really, did he truly understand? Since the supper, Aymar had come to doubt it. They have all become wolves, he thought. Bertrand has infected them, but of my wolf they know nothing. Still, when a man says he understands, you bow your head in gratitude. Aymar bowed his head. They walked along in silence. If I had known, my dear galleys, you can believe me. Do you think it was cruel of me? But come to think of it, it was just like the joke Grandmont told us. What was the joke about the dog? The joke about the dog? You see, I knew at once when you came about the wolf that you knew it was no wolf. And when you said how deeply you were interested in the matter, I realized at once. You realized what? Aymar asked, still not following. That he was your dog. Of course anybody could see it was no wolf except that newspaper man. He wanted a story, and we wanted a dog for our cook. And then I thought, if I say nothing, wouldn't that be cruel? And the happy thought struck me. I might take you along, and at least you would be in on his funeral. Better than nothing, wasn't it? Too bad, of course, but the happy thought pierced Aymar like a blade of cold steel. The wolf or dog had been served at that infernal supper. Bertrand. They had eaten Bertrand. His flesh was delicate in savor, although a trifle stringy. God Almighty! Horror tingling in every nerve of his body. He ran off without a word. But, galleys, forgive me, he heard the directeur's voice shouting after him. But Aymar fled as if a pack of wolves were snapping at his heels, his stomach revolting. In a dark recess he stopped and retched till he was weak and clean. But it was only when the morning papers came out with another horrible and gory crime that Aymar felt better. They hadn't killed Bertrand. Bertrand was still alive. Witness this. In the Rue de Budapest lived La Belle Normande, so-called, or rather so self-dubbed, in order to attract customers from that province, an honest prostitute, highly respected in her own quarter, if nowhere else. Last night a young man of prepossessing exterior, in the uniform of the Garde Nationale, so the concierge states, came home with La Belle Normande. The two retired and were not heard of again until his handiwork came to light. This morning La Belle Normande requires a successor to the affection of her numerous countrymen in Paris. She herself is dead, slashed by a rough, coarse instrument, literally ripped apart. So she was found lying in a pool of blood on the floor of her room. Nothing seems to have been stolen. Has the London Jack the Ripper crossed the Channel? The police are combing the battalions of the Guard. The nature of the deed betrayed the real culprit. So Bertrand was in the National Guard. Why, of course, every young man was there. The Société Impériale Zoologique d'Alimentation. It was this M. Gerardo who achieved a species of notoriety during the famine, when cheese was absolutely unprocurable for love or money, by mounting a small slice of fromage debris on a gold scarf pin. Here, as everywhere, one must note the trail of business. As the Société of the Jardin d'Acclimatation found it more and more difficult to secure food for the beasts in its care, they were sold to enterprising butchers and fine restaurants who could, as a result, offer, though of course at enormous prices, such rare meats and fowl as cassowary, ostrich, dingo, tapir, kangaroo, etc. Of interest is the sale of the 2 elephants, Castor and Pollux, who went to the wealthy butcher Debus for 27,000 francs. These ponderous beasts, for 25 years adored by the children of Paris who had ridden on their backs at 50 centimes a ride, went to grace the platters of the Jockey Club and other eating places for the rich. The 2 elephants, facing their doom, were nonplussed. Having been subjected to nothing but kindness all their lives, they could not suspect anything but kindness in the motives and actions of those who now led them into the slaughterhouse. There was some discussion as to how the killing could best be done. Finally, a powerful fellow swung an enormous mallet with all the might of his bulky muscles. The heavy wood crashed into the forehead of one of the elephants. The beast swayed, while blood spurted from a great dent in his brow. He looked puzzled for a moment, but only for a moment, and then he regained his lifelong assurance that only caresses and food emanated from the 2-legged animal. Eventually a sharpshooter was employed to kill the brutes with well-placed bullets. The meat sold for upwards of 142 francs a pound. Chapter 12. Aymar had deduced correctly. Bertrand was in the National Guard. Where else should a young man be, who was in Paris during the siege, but in the National Guard, where he was sure of his daily solde? The workshops were empty there. Was not a job to be had, but no man need worry with the National Guard ready to take on anybody who was willing to sign his name. As to actual service, that was another matter. When it was decreed that the soldiers were to elect their own officers, discipline was done for, since the officers were for a large part more interested in pleasing their men and in conserving their offices than in planning an effective resistance against the Prussians. Bertrand, having soon exhausted his money in a round of debauches in search of a repetition of the pleasure he had had with Therese, was easily persuaded by a chance acquaintance to join the National Guard, which he did under a very slightly altered name, which explains why Aymar could not find him on the registers. In the turmoil of that period there was not much time for clerks to make investigations. Many men enrolled in several battalions under different names, and collected so much more pay. Only a stupid few neglected to have wives and children, and thus lost the increases which went with a family to support. The elected officers too were willing to plug their lists, and receive pay for 1,000 men when they could muster only 800, pocketing the difference as well-merited earnings for their astuteness. But it is not right to demand virtues from the poor who must starve to practice them. It would be better to ask what the rich of Paris were doing. No doubt about it, they were doing their share of patriotic work and being well rewarded for it, as the rich generally are. Bertrand in these days was hard-pressed to satisfy that hidden appetite, which he had only recently come to understand clearly, but now fully aware of. The reverse side of his nature, he regulated his life so as to satisfy this need without endangering his safety. He rented a cheap basement room far in the rear of a house. A window which he could leave open allowed him to escape and return unnoticed at night. During the day he locked the window carefully, going to the trouble of purchasing and affixing a new lock. He did the same for his door, and thus guarded himself from any possible intrusion by the concierge, a busybody who wanted to mother him, look after his room and mend his clothing. He knew when an attack was coming on. During the day he would have no appetite. It was particularly the thought of bread and butter that nauseated him. In the evening he would feel tense and both tired and sleepless. Then he would arrange his window and lock his door, and having taken his precautions, he would lie down. Frequently he would wake in the morning in bed with no recollection of what had happened at night, only a wretched stiffness in his neck, a lassitude in his limbs that could come from nothing but miles of running, scratches on his hands and feet, and an acrid taste in his mouth, argued that he had spent the night elsewhere. On one such occasion, however, full conviction awaited him when he rose. Under his bed he caught a flash of white. It was a human forearm, a man's. The fingers were clutched tightly into a fist. Hair, as if torn from a fur coat, protruded from the interstices between the fingers. He racked his brain. Where? Whom? Evidently a man with a fur coat. Vague pictures of himself leaping gleefully through snow and slush, with a wind laden with icy crystals sweeping through the deserted streets of night, moaning among the chimney tops. and catching the breath from one's lungs at. Turnings came back to him. But a man with a fur coat? He couldn't remember. Any man with a fur coat. He did, however, recall that as a concession to his nature he had followed a late funeral to the Cimetière Montparnasse. It was a dreary cold day, heavily clouded with the feel of snow in the air. The shivering mourners trudged behind and Bertrand marched with them. The relatives and friends did not bother about the young man in the uniform of the National Guard, who seemed to be mourning in his own quiet way. At such moments one respects the grief of others and is satisfied with any mental excuse. A café friend, one to whom the deceased did a kind turn once upon a time, and so forth. It even added a glamour to Bertrand, a glamour which was heightened by his shyness, by his rapid withdrawal when the ceremony was over. Only one old man had spoken to Bertrand. He did not interrogate Bertrand much. He seemed more anxious to do the talking himself. "Are you a friend of Madame or of Blaise?" was his only question, but this was but a precaution, for when Bertrand answered by chance, "Of Blaise," the man continued at once. "A scholar, if ever there was one, the kindest man you ever met. God only knows what ever led him to marry such a young girl, when he was nearly 50. And I warned him too. 'Blaise,' I said again and again, 'you're an old fool. A young and lively girl like that will kill an old fellow like you. She'll suck the lifeblood out of you. You won't be able to stand the pace.' But he was bent on it. She had him bewitched. Still, I never thought that the end was to come so soon. Barely 3 months of married life. And you know," the old man continued, sinking his voice to a confidential tone, "there is something about this that I don't like. 2 days ago he was in excellent health. I saw him myself and spoke to him too. The next day, dead, and the next buried. Why this unseemly haste? And as for the widow, she seems more concerned about striking an elegant pose of grief than genuinely indulging in her sorrow. Ah well, Blaise, my old friend, it will be a long time before I forget you." When Bertrand had recalled this conversation, all the other details of the night came back to him. The open pit, which because of the late burial had been left unfilled, the coffin, which now was covered with a thin layer of earth and snow, and then the horrible fight with a corpse recovering from a heavy drug. And then he understood something else. Not fur from a coat, but his own fur. Those grayish and brownish hairs were his own. Then it was not just an illusion that he changed. It was not a mere alteration of the desires of his muscles, but a real transformation. Could one believe that? How, with pause, could he have pried off a heavy coffin lid? This was a point on which he would have liked to assure himself, but a decision to take note of the matter on the next occasion was of little avail. Even when he awoke outside, and found himself lying beside a new grave or beside someone whom he had evidently attacked in the street, he could not recall whether he had been a beast or only a man acting like a beast. Apparently, on these excursions he was incapable of rational human thoughts, but not for all that devoid of the cunning necessary to the accomplishment of his purposes. When he had first come to Paris and still had remnants of the money taken from Jacques, he had frequented the Maisons Tuileries, but he soon had to abandon this form of amusement, for the girls of Paris were experienced in their line, and like barbers charged exorbitantly for every deviation from the normal, for every added attraction. On the slender pay of a soldier, Bertrand could not afford expensive amusements. He sought in the streets for cheaper material. Occasionally he was successful, more often not. Then, bursting with a sullen rage, he would deceive a woman of the streets with grand promises. These amorous exploits frequently ended in murder. This was especially the case when it became impossible to find fresh graves to despoil. Of his life as a soldier there is little to be said. The military annals of the National Guard are an empty book. Bertrand saw little fighting. He paraded frequently, he saw festivities, he listened to much talk on this and that plan to save Paris. He made few friends of his comrades. In the late afternoon, when his duties were finished, he generally went to a canteen, sipped a glass of wine, and ruminated morosely about his disease. One canteen to which he was accustomed to go was especially favored by the soldiers, not so much for its wines as for a young girl who donated several hours of service to it almost every afternoon. She was of more than human beauty. She was slight of stature and could not have been over 17. Within these limits, Her physique was of that perfect variety which transcends clothes and would have looked as graceful and strong draped in the blanket of a savage as she did in her expensive clothes. Her dusky face was a perpetual delight, for a permanent smile transfigured it, and revealed teeth whose whiteness was flawless. Her quick black eyes wandered from man to man, and she had a pleasant word and laugh for all. She was Mlle Sophie de Blumenberg, daughter of the famous banker. Many of the men, particularly the officers of course, made attempts to draw her into something more than mere banter, but she would not allow herself to be led astray. When her coach drove up and the footman descended to open the door, she slipped out of her apron, took off her military cap, wrapped herself in her furs, waved her muff in a gesture of goodbye, and was off. Frequently an officer, recognizable by his gaudy uniform as a military person of importance, and by some actually known to be Captain Beryl de Montfort, appeared to escort Mlle Sophie. They were a distinguished pair. He perfect in his smart military bearing, she in her exotic type of beauty. One envies such people, but in the same breath one wishes heaped upon their heads all the joys that life can offer, and yet so insistently refuses to most of us. For such people seem as if selected by nature to be showered with the best gifts. She herself wanted of life an endless succession of new wonders, new pleasures and surprises. And indeed, all her life had been such a succession for her, and she had that infinite capacity to enjoy, without which a princess must remain unhappy even in the finest palace of the world. During their drives together, she took pleasure in teasing Beryl. She told him of how all the men adored her. She described some of them, insisted upon their handsome physique, declared they would outshine Beryl if they were permitted to wear his bright blue uniform with its gold braid adornments. Seeing that she was pleased if he appeared annoyed and jealous, he did his best to frown and find angry words to say to her. Madame Herzog, Sophie's aunt, Louise, who tried to be present as often as she could in order to chaperone, remained frozen and indignant during these playful quarrels, which she found in very poor taste indeed. She found, in fact, the whole canteen business highly disgraceful for a daughter of the aristocracy, and could not approve of a patriotism carried to such excess. Such patriotism, she correctly divined, was a mere excuse for looseness of conduct. But Baron de Blumenberg was incapable of refusing anything to his daughter, his only child. Furthermore, a display of patriotism was always a good business policy. He had been patriotic under the Empire and was patriotic again under the government of September 4th. He would even make a gesture of patriotism to the Commune. Good business demanded as much. He had contributed a large sum of money to the maintenance of the canteens, but the personal appearance of his daughter was an even more effective gesture. Besides, the daughters and wives of the best families of Paris were engaged either in canteen work or in nursing. At dinner, Aunt Louise never failed to bring up the question of Sophie, her neglected education, her work at the canteen, her freedom, one might almost say promiscuity. And later in the evening, when she prepared to return to her apartment, there was more quarreling because the family allowed Sophie to stay up so late. Beryl de Montfort took his leave and accompanied Madame Herzog. In the carriage, she confided to him, "You're too good for that crowd, even if you are Christian." He did not know whether to feel flattered or insulted. Ever since those artists have made bad morals fashionable, the world is fast degenerating. This war is only another proof of it. He murmured a polite agreement with her thesis. "I recall," she said, drawing in her chin with indignation, "when that fellow Courbet put his picture of a naked woman in the salon. I was there when the Empress turned her back on it in horror. Of course all Paris was congregated in front of that picture. Since then there's been no stopping the degringolade. Bad pictures, bad books, and the most shameless goings-on," he said, terrible, with the proper inflection. She looked at him severely. "I had good fun in my youth without being improper." It was on the tip of his tongue to ask her how. "I suppose your generation would find me very prim." He would have liked to say, "Sophie is perhaps more prim than you if you only knew her." When he had returned to his own apartment and removed his cape and sword, he sat down and thought of Sophie. Sophie's dress of tightly laced white velvet, faintly tinted with lemon, her trailing skirt of white satin and frills, as if she had stepped out of the surf and a wave had dashed after her with a foaming white crest, And out of this calyx of whiteness, her beautifully curving shoulders and bosom as if of polished bronze, her bare brown arms, her dark, laughing face, her hair in ebony ringlets. It was his duty as well as his pleasure and privilege to write to her every night and think of new ways to describe her waxy black eyebrows rising in decisive curvatures from her perfectly modeled brow. It was his duty to find new comparisons for her teeth, white like gardenia petals, or better still, like forest roots broken fresh and glistening from the ground. It was his nightly duty to write down all these things, interspersed with his professions of love, and mail the letter to her so that she would have it to read in the morning. When the few dinner guests had departed and the Baron had retired to his bureau where he generally slept, the Baroness to her boudoir, then Sophie itched to do something. But what was there to do? If she went to Papa, he would welcome her with a smile, caress her, talk inanities of the days when she was a little baby. If she went to Mama, she would be received with inquiries about her health, talk of clothes, and most certainly with a round scolding interjected at some point in the conversation. The great apartment was quiet. The massive furniture gleamed, the brass fittings of scrolls and sphinxes glittered under the gaslight. Somewhere behind a door, she knew, a sleepy servant was yawning and waiting for her to depart so that he could extinguish the lights. She picked up a few magazines from the drawing-room table, a few books from the library, and went off to her own room. She read until her eyes ached, and yet there was nothing to interest her. She undressed and read in bed and put off until the last possible moment the turning off of the gaslight on the wall, the blowing out of the candle on her night table. At last she took her courage in both hands, reached out and turned off the jet. The continuous hissing noise of the escaping gas, a noise of which she had not been conscious until then, stopped. The great porcelain soot catcher dropped its bursting whiteness and shrank into gray. The whole room was as if suddenly yanked out of the beautiful present and pulled back into the dark ages. The single candle cast yawning shadows. The corners of the room, swathed in darkness, retreated into a distant mysterious gloom. A little life still remained huddled about the candle. She blew that out. Darkness engulfed her. Even the Middle Ages vanished. She had retreated to the pitch black of prehistoric times. She cast herself back among her pillows and prayed that sleep would come soon. But her nerves were too taut. She had to listen to a dozen incomprehensible noises and trace each one to its source. She had to dissect a score of vague shadows, hulking, threatening shapes, and determine the reality of each. She suspected each new shadow that her peering eyes carved out of the general blackness, and was not content with the reassurance that she had been wrong 100 times before. She looked and looked until all the darkness of the room was alive with swirling shadowy figures, products of visual fatigue, and she told herself as much, but each new shape looked more real than the last. They were but waiting for her to close her eyes, to come plunging down on her. No, she would remain awake all night. She did not dare close her eyes in sleep. In the same manner in which darkness concluded the day, death concluded life. She exhausted herself in sterile attempts to pierce the mystery of the tomb. What was it like to be dead? It was like this: darkness, intense darkness, and shadows among shadows, and a vast fear. No, it wasn't like that at all. It was like complete nothingness, absolute blankness. But within this nothingness, something more horrible than the mind can imagine. That was death, lying underground in a coffin. Her imagination had already put her there 1,000 times. In Père Lachaise, in the Jewish portion of the cemetery, not far from the entrance, next to the mournful monument of Rachel, the tragedienne, there were the plots belonging to the Blumenbergs and the Herzogs. She recalled the day Uncle Moise, the husband of Aunt Louise Herzog, had died. The cortege had gone through the Rue du Repos, the Street of Rest. Strange name, fascinating and revolting at the same time. She would lie there. Mother and father would lie there. Perhaps she would lie there first. She could hear in her ears her father and mother crying. She could hear her mother saying, "So young, and just married." And her husband, Beryl, was there. She could hear him swearing vengeance. When she had reached that thought, she decided that all her imaginings were really silly. Why should he be swearing vengeance, and against whom? But her heart still bled from her gruesome thoughts. Of course it was all too silly. How could she be married to Beryl and be buried in the old family plot? She would be buried with him, of course. Wives did. Somehow that was reassuring. To be buried with Beryl. Besides, it showed that there was no truth in her imagination. No prophetic power. That picture of Beryl swearing vengeance in the cimetière Israelite of Père Lachaise couldn't ever be true. Then she thought. But Beryl's parents, who lived in the country and were known to be but slightly pleased at their son's affair, might not let her, Jewess, be buried in a Christian cemetery? And the whole story took on once again its threatening aspect and descended on her chest like a heavy stone. In the morning there was not a shred left of her dreams. Daylight filtered in through the draperies of the window. She was lying in her lovely bed with its gilt cupids. Above her head was her familiar azure ciel de lit, spangled with gold stars and illuminated by a white moon stitched with silk. Gone were the crazy dreams of cemeteries, of Beryl swearing vengeance, all the stupid cobwebs with which darkness litters the brain. She rose early. Before her mother, she might have her mother's maid to help her dress and arrange her hair, and soon the mailman would come and bring her Beryl's description of her loveliness on the previous evening and his assurance of eternal love. Such were the dreams of the day. The nights might become even more horrible. The Germans might move their gun emplacements to within a few miles of the ring of forts and drop their bombs into the very city. Then one had to go to bed without any light at all, or only the slightest illumination, and sleep was often impossible. The winter nights were cold and long. It required effort not to scream out in anguish. But then the day was all the more to be enjoyed. Every second must offer her a laugh, otherwise life would bring no compensation for the inevitable night. Thus her days were full of laughter and her nights full of anguish. But so, she used to think, I at least have the compensation of wealth. What do the poor do? She had Beryl. What did those poor girls do who had no letters from Beryl? During her hours at the canteen she thought of Beryl. He would come and fetch her. She would see him from a distance, either on foot or on horse, but always in a bright blue uniform with golden aiguillettes. The men too saw him coming. They nudged each other and smiled. But there was one young man, neither very handsome nor ugly, with only great brown eyes to recommend him. Every day Sophie noticed while the others smiled he remained sullen. Once when she bent to rinse a glass, she looked full into those sad eyes. There was something strangely moving in them, something that brought her night thoughts to mind. She looked away because she feared he might have seen into her eyes and that he might have read there the thoughts he had called up, her thoughts of terror and of death. But again and again at the canteen when she thought he wasn't looking, she would glance at those eyes wide open under heavy brows. Almost always his glance shifted quickly toward hers and he caught her eye. Then she would look away. But a moment later she would look again. There was something compelling in his eyes, something of that strange compulsion of an abyss, that invitation of the void of great heights. Come, cast yourself down. Just let yourself go. How do you know it isn't sweeter than anything you have ever imagined or experienced in life? Why do you fear? Why do you fear what you do not know as yet? Come, come. Oh, the opium-sweet attraction of death. She knew that attraction. How many times had she not revolved such thoughts in her mind at night, when she had extinguished the gas and blown out the candle? During the day, when away from the canteen, she rarely thought of those eyes, but at night they haunted her. They were there before her in the darkness, and had that strange phosphorescent glow that the eyes of some animals have. Those eyes mingled with her night thoughts. They were her companions during the long ugly night. They were with her in the Jewish cemetery at Père Lachaise. She was not alone at night any longer. Those eyes had rescued her from her lonely nightmares. She asked those eyes, what of the grave? What of the moldering bodies in the grave? And the eyes had an answer. The eyes said, wherever you are I will be with you, night and day, life and death. In the morning these thoughts were gone. She had Beryl's letter, and as she planned what visits, what shopping she might do during the day, her light laughter resounded again and again. Even in his bureau, her father could hear her. He smiled and shook his head. Gay little chick. How can one be so perpetually light-hearted? Especially our Sophie, who was, so to speak, born out of the grave. God bless her. But in the afternoon when she entered the canteen, her eyes began to seek for him at once. If he was not there, she was almost glad, but not quite. She found herself looking around expectantly, hoping to see him come in, hoping with that tremor of mingled fear and desire. And while she smiled at the men as if she had not another thought in the world but pleasure, gaiety, amusement, she looked around. He came. He always came. He sat alone and brooded on the crazy fate that had made him half a man and half a beast. Sometimes he thought he would consult a doctor. It might be that there existed a cure for such cases as his. But no, his case was unique. Besides, it was silly to think of such things. He could not go to a doctor. He did not dare. The number of his crimes barred that way forever. Perhaps if he were wounded, taken to a hospital, there might be a possibility of interrogating a physician. He used to pause at the bookstalls and examine medical texts, but what he discovered was of little value. He learnt that his disease was known, that is to say, it had a name, but observers classed it either as a fraud or as a delusion, and as far as curing it goes, no one had any suggestions to offer, except that the medieval method of burning was an unmerited cruelty. He began to think that this rejection of the cure by fire was as superficial a decision as that which rejected his disease, and that there was, on the contrary, much to recommend the stake. He contemplated seriously the necessity of taking his life. These thoughts had grown more frequent when he stepped by chance into the canteen where Sophie worked. He saw her and was at once in love with her. Thereafter he came every day. She represented to him all that he was not, all that he could never be. She was the epitome of that which he had lost and could never recover, the joie de vivre. Then he began to notice that she was observing him, and one day when their eyes met, he had the feeling that there was a bond between her and him. He shuddered to think of the filth from which he dared look up to her purity, and he vowed seriously that he would reform himself. He decided that hereafter he would gorge himself with human food during the day, so that his ghastly appetite of the night would diminish. But that first night, despite the gorging, he woke up from his sleep, his body tense, robbed of all desire for further rest, his skin aching to feel the freedom of the night air, his limbs yearning to touch the ground, his jaws to bite and rend. For a while he fought with himself to keep her image uppermost in his mind. He panted through his open mouth, and he felt his tongue, the short and bulky tongue of man, begin to flatten and lengthen. "God help me!" he cried. But now that tongue was curling out of his mouth, was hanging over his teeth. Unable to resist any more, he sprang from his bed. He went to a corner of his room, muzzled under a piece of cloth, and dragged forth an arm. A human arm. The last of the two arms he had taken from La Belle Normande. He sank his teeth into it. His eyes glared around suspiciously. Low growls came from his throat. For a while there was silence, then there were more noises, the slap of the hard dead hand as it hit the floor, the crunching of a bone, and occasionally a sharp tick as a ring on one finger struck wood. At last his hunger was appeased, but he had no recollection of it. Morning found him in bed, his head heavy, his neck aching, his tongue furred. It was difficult to get up, but having succeeded at last, he began the disgusting task of cleaning up the remains on the floor. He dressed himself and went out to join his regiment. As he traversed the courtyard, the fat concierge came dashing out. Monsieur, leave me your key finally. I would like to clean your room." "Here it is," he said darkly, "but in that case I'm moving." "Ah, monsieur," she said. "How many times have I told you that I don't want my room cleaned? What do you think I had my own lock put on for? So you could come in and disturb me whenever you pleased." "Ah, mais. Well, do you want the key or not?" "Ah, mais voyons. Merde alors," he exclaimed and walked off. "Pooh," she breathed. "Quelle bête féroce. You think I wanted to spy on him? Well, I bet he has something to conceal if he keeps his door locked that way." Self-righteous, her lips compressed, she returned to her interrupted scrubbing. When his duties were over, Bertrand went to the canteen and sat sullen, filled with horror at himself. "You've besmirched yourself foully. How dare you even come into the same room with that pure being?" He wished with all his strength that he might turn into some loathsome insect, a spider for example, and that he could run beneath her foot and die crushed under her soul. "No," he thought, "she would not even step on me. Even a poisonous bug she would let live. She's too good." But though he tried to restrain himself, he did at last look up. Her eyes were upon him, but she shifted her glance quickly. Her gaze wandered back, however. As if magnetized, her eyes looked into his, and his looked into hers. Lasted but a fraction of a second, but it might have been years. That evening he made a deep vow, and when he reached his room he wrapped all the flesh and bones he had, and adding a stone for weight made a tight package which he contrived unnoticed to sink into the Seine. No more of that, he said. No more. Never. I swear it by your eyes. He was in love. He was in love. As he wandered home a woman accosted him, but he shook his head violently. Ugly creature, he said to himself. He was through with that sort. He had suddenly become very prim. He went home and slept soundly. In the morning he woke up from a dreamless sleep. I'm cured. He wanted to shout to the sunlight that in the early morning found its way into his room. I'm cured. She has cured me. With her help it needed only a good effort. In the afternoon at the canteen he was moved to rush up and thank her, but he did not dare. However, he found a piece of paper and wrote, You have rescued me from my nightmares. You are an angel. But for 2 days he carried the scrap of paper around and did not dare give it to her. Finally, one afternoon, when he saw her coach driving up in the possibility about to be lost for another day, he walked rapidly past the counter and pushed the paper across to her. She snatched it and hid it away in her sleeve, as if she had been expecting a message from him, as if she had been secreting billets due from him all her life. Before she rode off with Beryl she had a chance to glance at the note. You have rescued me from my nightmares. The effect on her was electrical. How did he know? How did he know about her dreams? She was not in the mood for Beryl's gaiety, but she dissembled. It had come to be natural for her to be perpetually smiling and laughing. She could do it, despite her trembling heart. Sophie, said Aunt Louise, shaking her head, will you never be serious? Sophie stopped laughing. She was struck by the similarity of their thoughts. She, like Aunt Louise, had been thinking, is that all you have, Beryl? Jokes and smart replies and pretty nonsense? What do you think of at night? She could formulate the answer he would give to such a question. I think of you all night long, and if God is good I dream of you too in my sleep. Pretty conceit and nothing more. A good fellow this Beryl, but shallow and silly. And she held that reply against him without ever giving him the opportunity to make it. For several weeks Sophie and Bertrand confined themselves to an exchange of notes, but these protestations of mutual dreams and love soon ceased to satisfy. She craved more intimacy. In the evenings at home with Beryl, and generally under the watchful eye of Aunt Louise, Sophie nearly yawned. If Beryl would only leave, she thought, then I could go to bed and be with my Bertrand's eyes. She was no longer so afraid of the dark, no longer so afraid of death, since she knew her fate shared. Once Aunt Louise left them alone for a minute, and Sophie, unaware of what she was doing, ceased her light chatter. She was thinking, poor Beryl, I'll be leaving you soon. And under a sudden impulse of pity, she laid her hand in his, frightened by this open declaration of affection, a token greater than any she had ever shown him. He clasped his fingers round hers and was so weak with love that he could not say anything, with astonishment and a joy so deep that it was painful. He saw her eyes fill with tears. He heard her say, poor Beryl. Aunt Louise entered and suggested that it was late. He took her home, feeling all the while as if he were floating on clouds, and when he had reached his apartment, he forgot to take off his cape in his haste to sit down and write. To Sophie, he filled more pages than ever. He described his emotions a dozen times, swore his love in every paragraph, and when he went out to post his letter it was 3 o'clock, but he was in no mood for sleep that night. In the morning Sophie took his letter to her room and sat down, intending to read it, but her thoughts carried her off to Bertrand. She wondered how best to arrange a meeting with him. It grew late, and time to hasten off to a silly appointment which she regretted ever having made, except insofar as such appointments kept people from discovering her secret. But before she left home she must write a note for Bertrand. Why not say that she would come to his house? Yes, she must do that. Soon, almost any day now. The siege might be over, and with that the canteens and a large measure of her freedom. She wrote the note and was about to hurry off. Then she remembered Beryl's letter, which she had not yet read. Bah, she said. Some other time, and threw it unopened into a drawer of her secrétaire. That evening Bertrand could scarcely control himself from shouting with joy. She was coming to his house. She was actually coming into his room. She could only spare a half hour, but she would come sharp at the dot. And they would be together and alone. The night no longer had any terrors for him. He knew he would sleep through. And if he dreamt at all, it would be of her. In the morning as he was leaving, he bethought himself. Madame La Bouvet, he shouted into a dark hole. Oui, monsieur. Oui, monsieur. The concierge shouted back and came running out, her ample bosom dancing with the motion imparted by her strides. Voilà la clef, he said. Please clean up thoroughly. She was too astonished to speak. In spite of himself he smiled. He could smile now that he belonged to the human race again. Someone is coming to see me. She understood and laughed with him. Ah, monsieur, she said, drawing out her words. Then she chuckled. I'll clean it. I'll scrub your room so clean you will be able to eat off the floor. He shuddered, controlled himself, and smiling a goodbye walked off. She remained looking after him, standing out in the chilly winter air. And so that's all he wanted to make him act more human? Those young fellows take that sort of thing too seriously. But after all, what else is there to life? Sophie came on time. He met her at the corner of the street and showed her through the maze of courts and dark corridors to his room. I'll remember next time, she said, and smiled up at him. Within, she noted the ugliness of his chamber. The window that did not look out upon the sky but upon walls. The chairs that were hard and uncomfortable. They sat together on the bed and held each other's hands. And they were silent, filled with rapid thoughts and emotions, but embarrassed. What should they do now that they were together? They did nothing, just sat and looked at each other. At last, in a voice that was hoarse from its weight of love, he excused the meanness of his quarters. And she, in a voice warm and throbbing, expressed some equally trite remark. They may have been sitting thus for some 20 minutes or more and exchanging remarks that were far from inspired, when a strange thought obtruded itself into her mind. What was she doing here in this room? Who was this young man, whose hand she was holding in her own, clasping it with force as if she would have sooner parted with her life? Why? A strange terror took hold of her, the kind of a terror one has when just before waking from a bad dream one's whole being shrieks, "This can't be true," and yet fears that it may. Abruptly she dropped his hand and rose. "You're not going yet," he exclaimed. "I must," she said. "Don't," he pleaded. Her eyes were darting around the room as if she imagined she were trapped in a cage. And indeed she did feel trapped. She must get out. She had put herself into a living nightmare. She had entombed herself alive. She made a move toward the door, but he caught hold of her hand again and held her. "Let me go," she cried in a whisper. He wanted to let her go, but his fingers wouldn't loosen. He drew her slowly back toward himself. She held her hand before her face as if she would ward him off. Her eyes were wide open in terror. "Don't hurt me," she begged. "Oh, please don't hurt me." Thereupon he suddenly released her. "I wasn't going to hurt you," he said in a pained voice. He looked away and said, "You may go if you like. Shall I show you the way to the street?" Her momentary terror vanished. What had she been afraid of? She was filled with contrition instead. Impulsively she put her arms around him. His own arms remained at his side. It was now his turn to be frightened. He realized that for a moment at least he had lost control of himself. He did not dare clasp her in his arms. It would be better if he never saw her again. Better still if he killed himself quickly. "Bertrand," she said softly, entreatingly. He did not answer. "Bertrand," she cried out in despair, "don't you love me?" He sighed out. "I love you so madly it were better I—" "Then quick, put your arms around me," she interrupted. He obeyed. "You must hold me tighter," she said. Again he obeyed. "Tighter still," she whispered. Such a bliss flowed through her from the feel of his arms about her, from his body pressed close to hers, that her head grew dizzy, her breath came and went. Her body tensed and then seemed about to dissolve in liquid. About to dissolve, but not quite. If only he would press harder. If only he would crush her, tear her, mutilate her. Hold me tighter still," she panted. And still she was on that point. of dissolving and could not dissolve. In desperation she cried out, "Hurt me! Bertrand, hurt me!" Then she felt his arms closing around her like a vice. And within this circle of pain she experienced a strange exultation, as if a bird within her had been released and was filling her ears with a wild singing. And it was as if all her body dissolved away. She breathed heavily. They were still standing near the bed. "You're hurting me," she said at last. At once his arms loosened. She looked up at him, looked first into one of his eyes and then into the other. She was searching there for an explanation of the joy she had just lived through. There was nothing, only strange big brown eyes under heavy brows that were out of place on so boyish a face. She was grateful to him. She wanted to give him some sign of her gratitude. What could she say? What could she do? They were sitting on the bed again and holding hands. "What large nails you have," she exclaimed. "Don't look at them," he said. "They are ugly." "You mustn't say that. They are not ugly. They are very beautiful and so shiny. But why are they so big?" "Because," he said and halted. "Because it's a disease." "A disease?" "Yes." "What kind of a disease?" He was on the verge of casting himself at her feet and telling her all, but he restrained himself and sought for a way to turn the conversation. "It's called onychographosis," he said. "Onycho what?" she asked. "Onychographosis," he repeated. Her laughter tinkled through the room. "You must write it down for me." "Let us look at your nails instead," he suggested. "Like polished jewels." He put them to his mouth and kissed them. He felt tempted to nip her fingertips with his teeth, and he did so, but ever so gently. And yet he had hurt her. She had wanted to exclaim and draw her fingers away, but she didn't. Was not this the way she could show her gratitude? She insisted. "Bite them if you want to." And as he hesitated, she asked, "Do you want to?" He felt as he had once when as a little boy he had confessed to his mother of a pain in his groin and she had wanted to see. He conquered his shame and answered, "Yes, I do." But with that his desire had expired. "Some other time," he said. "Next time," she corrected. "Tomorrow." She rose. "Oh, how late. I shan't be able to go to the canteen." The short winter afternoon had faded into a gray cold twilight. They hurried out into the street to find a cab for her. Beryl was waiting at her home. Aunt Louise was there too and maintained the silence of intense indignation. Her mother began to scold at once. Beryl, however, was so relieved from his worry that he could only say, "Thank God. You're safe. Thank God." "Where were you?" her mother asked. "You have made everyone miserable. The whole house is upset on account of you." "Just strolling around," she said carelessly and went off to her room. After dinner she sat alone with Beryl. "I was so worried," he confessed. "I thought a German bomb had hit you and I determined to wreak a bloody vengeance on those Huns." She smiled. Good Beryl. And for the second time in their long courtship, she laid her hand on his. Deeply moved, he clasped it and spoke in a trembling, earnest voice. "Darling, what did you think of my letter? Did you think I was bold?" "Why, no," she said hesitatingly. He mistook the meaning of her embarrassment. "Why should I?" "Then dare I? Dare I?" he cried. "Why, Beryl," she exclaimed. "Will you please? I mean, may I kiss you?" She smiled again. She felt so immensely superior to him. "Of course you may," she said gently. He took her head between his hands and looked her in the face. "My dearest Sophie," he said in a choking voice. She was interested to know what could happen. He laid the mildest kiss ever on those sweet lips whose virginal purity he feared to soil. Nothing had happened. No bird sang a deafening song in her ears. Her body did not grow tense nor threaten to dissolve. Nothing. His kiss was reminiscent of the milk diluted with sweet warm water which her nurse used to give her to drink at night. He went home and wrote her the most impassioned letter he had ever penned. He poured out his whole heart into it. He asked her pardon 1,000 times, confessed to a dozen schoolboy peccadillos which made his lips unfit to touch her pure mouth. Could she ever forgive him for having concealed his miserable past from her? He swore by high heaven that ever since he had laid eyes on her 2 years ago, he had been clean as a newborn baby and would ever remain so. She threw his letter unopened in her bureau drawer. As her joy in her new love grew, and each time she went to Bertrand's room her body experienced some new exultation. She ceased to care whether anyone knew. More than that, she wanted to flaunt her love before other people. Look, she wanted to cry. Look what happens to me when my lover holds me in his arms. She felt at times as if she would like nothing better than to invite everybody into Bertrand's chamber, undress before them and ask, "Do you find me pretty? Look then, for all this beauty I give to him. See how he holds, kisses me, caresses every part of my body. Is there anyone else in the world who has such a lover?" The men at the canteen were not long in discovering her secret. They said to each other, "She was ready to be made. I don't understand why we left it to that young snot Bertrand. Any one of us could have ousted that sky-blue popinjay de Montfort." They grew bolder and cracked remarks which were far from innuendos. She laughed, and that heartened them. She was a good girl, that Sophie de Blumenberg, even if her father was a millionaire. "She's of our kind," they concluded, and smiled at each other. Goodwill and jollity reigned in the canteen when she was there. Beryl, however, was long in understanding what he certainly did not want to understand. He had, of course, noticed how of late Sophie's eyes sparkled and then veiled as if in a fever. He had noticed that never before had she been so bewitchingly beautiful. He had noticed that she had grown chubbier, had filled out. But he set this down to the natural attainment of maturity. And when he understood, it was too late to do anything. The siege was over, armistice was declared. France must cede Alsace and Lorraine and pay billions of indemnity. And then came the revolution and the declaration of the Paris Commune, and Beryl had undertaken a delicate task, that of spying, which prevented him from any violent action in his personal affairs. Chapter 13. Writing as he did, when the cataclysms through which Paris was passing were at their height and fresh in everybody's mind, Gallies makes little attempt to fill in the historical events of the moment. I have been at some pains to remedy this omission, for our day has forgotten these matters. Moreover, it seems to me that the temper of the period has a great importance in this tale. Gallies, too, now and then lets fall a hint that the atmosphere of the times played a not inconsiderable share in these strange events, though sometimes he inclines to the very opposite, that is, he intimates that the times were an infection spread abroad by Bertrand and by others like him. He says, "I now recognized a meaning in my aunt's, Madame Didier's, wish, expressed in her will, that I study for the priesthood. Was it the germ of religious belief thus sowed in me that protected me from Bertrand? I do not know, but this much I have observed. Few people have come in contact with him without suffering. I have often wondered if several such monsters might not, by geometrical progression, infect whole nations in a few days, like that walking, stalking image of cholera in Eugene Sue's romance. Yes, this would explain so much that is inexplicable in history. So it would, and certainly Paris seemed to be infected, though the cause is more easily traced to the horrors of war than to werewolves. The bitter winter, with multitudes starving, with babies dying like flies, with shells bursting in all directions, was an experience likely to weaken many characters. The city was full of hate and suspicion. A man of a too Germanic name or of a too Germanic cast of countenance was likely to suffer for what was scarcely his fault. Every strange house was peopled with spies. For people who took to sewers for warmth and refuge from a wintry night might wake rudely to find themselves vehemently suspected of planting bombs to blow up the city. An old woman, about to commit an indiscretion ordinarily beyond her years, hung her torn skirt before her window to dim the light of her candle and guard herself against betrayal. But the strange configuration of light, as seen from the outside, collected a crowd on the street, who saw in this mixture of dots and dashes where the light came through the torn garment a secret code signal to admit the Prussians to Paris. Instead of keeping her shame a secret, the poor woman found her room invaded, and her sin the latest joke of the street. One dark night during the bombing, a distant light in the east, evidently a signal lamp hung on some tall structure, caused a mob to chase clear across Paris. In vain an amateur astronomer attempted to convince them that they were chasing a planet of the solar system, only distantly interested in mundane matters through the bond of gravity. Once, upon the report of a patriotic amateur spy, a squad proceeded to the apartment house at No. 3 Place du Théâtre Français, armed with warrants of search and arrest. This was a serious business. It was said that at certain Times a black and white flag was to be seen hanging from the 4th floor. The squad returned rather shamefaced. The black and white flag was really blue and white and hung from the window of the consulate of Honduras. But if sometimes these suspicions ended in laughter, more often they terminated in corpses. Still, all things must have an end. Louis Adolphe Thiers became chief executive. The armistice was signed, the peace treaty was ratified, and the Germans made their brief triumphal march through Paris. The long siege was at last over. The heart of Paris bounded. Profiteers who had too long held on to their stocks of food were caught now by the raising of the siege, and hastily threw their produce on the market, flooding the stalls. Prices tumbled. There was a hint of spring in the air. Life was a delight. But the pall of hate and suspicion would not lift. Mobs smashed the shops and cafes that had remained open to trade with the Germans. There was talk that the government had betrayed the city. The National Guardsmen, nearly 400,000 strong, complained that treachery had prevented them from being properly employed, and they did not want to be demobilized. Demobilization meant starvation. But the new government evinced itself as stupidly reactionary. The moratorium on debts which had saved the poor during the war was to be lifted. For now that the national enemy no longer threatened, it was time to put the poor back in the harness, and the momentary spell of making them think that French economic slavery was to be preferred to German economic slavery was no longer to be continued. However, the popular notion that the Thiers politicians had betrayed their country to Prussia was erroneous. It was decidedly not true. A real politician, and these were real politicians, never betrays his country to an outsider. He betrays it to himself. He is the enemy within. Bismarck had proposito disarm the National Guard by offering a loaf of bread for every rifle. His offer was refused by Favre, who later regretted it. For the National Guard refused to disband, refused to begin again the weary business of looking for work at reduced pay, long hours, and no future. They demonstrated before the Hôtel de Ville. They threw up barricades. They shot a couple of generals. The Thiers government fled to Versailles, gathered its forces, and returned to give the city its second siege. Paris had the Commune. It wasn't what the people were after. But the people are always like that. Like a righteous man raising his axe to scotch a snake and gashing his shin. Instead, that is a picture to be found on almost every page of history. The Russians have made a national holiday of March 18th, when the Commune was formed. But they are worshipping a legend, though it is true that the Commune was a mistake from which a new generation of revolutionaries was to learn a lot. The Commune was a proletarian government, yes, but so is a hobo camp. The Commune was never anything but the gnashing of teeth of men annoyed at their impotence and failure. Among these men were many lovers of mankind, many old workers in the field, men who had spent much of their lives in prison for their political opinions, men who went here to their martyrdom, but there were also many incompetents, opportunists, personally ambitious, and more traitors than most governments have had to wrestle with. Aymar, like most old Republicans, particularly those who had taken part in the Revolution of 1848, was offered a post in the Commune government. He declined several and finally accepted a minor post involving few duties and no pay. Under Courbet, the painter, who had been appointed director of fine arts by the Republic, and continued as such under the Commune, Aymar was glad to renew an acquaintance which went back to the days of Balzac in the brasserie of the Rue Hautefeuille. A fissure, however, had split him apart from most of his old associates. He did not see eye to eye with them on the question of religion as formerly. He was as anxious as ever to divorce the priesthood from politics, education, and industry, but he could no longer find in the phrase "religion is just a superstition" the forceful argument he had once thought it. But on this matter, he kept his mouth shut. It was not a safe thing to speak, as Aymar had more than one opportunity to discover. For example, during the Paipas affair, Aymar accompanied Courbet one day shortly after the insurrection to the magnificent hotel which the Baron de Blumenberg inhabited at the Place Saint-Georges. They found the palace almost emptied of its famous collection of objets d'art. Courbet's fame rather than his frankly boorish demeanor entitled him to be received by the Baron himself, who apologized for the appearance of the house. They were leaving for a summer vacation in the country, he said. The stocky, jovial genius took his pipe from his mouth and guffawed. A lot of People were finding it convenient to take their summer vacations early, he remarked. As yet the way out of Paris was free and many, aware of what was coming, were taking refuge before the storm burst. Courbet's visit was one connected with his position as president of the Society of Artists and as director of arts. He was concerned with the safety, from the fury of the mob, of the artwork in the house of Adolphe Thiers nearby, and that in the houses of other famous collectors. In the back of his mind was the thought that all collections of art should pass into the safekeeping of the state. In particular, he wished to enrich the collection in the Louvre. It was upon this occasion that Aymar Galli's was introduced to and first saw a certain Sophie de Blumenberg, a ravishing beauty of about 17. In his script, Aymar Galli's recalls this visit only briefly in connection with its subsequent importance. It would therefore be well for the reader to linger here a moment in the company of the author, and take a closer look at the Blumenberg menage. The Baron de Blumenberg was one of the most prominent citizens of Paris. His patronage of art, his charity, his lavish hospitality concealed with a pretty varnish the nefarious manner by which he had accumulated his millions. His generous right hand was extended in such a friendly gesture to the people of Paris, rich and poor alike, that the actions of his left hand went unnoticed. True, the pamphleteers had found him out. He was the target for their naive but biting wit. They exaggerated his paunch, which infuriated him. It is said that Courbet allowed himself to be bribed to treat that paunch leniently in a portrait he was commissioned to make. The Baron was greatly pleased to see high-priced artists depict him more as he wished he looked. He was that childish in his emotions, but in concocting a wily business scheme, in putting through a contract in which one harmless-looking clause buried deep in the writ meant $1 million to his privy purse. For that there was no better brain in Paris. The September Revolution and the fall of the Empire had not disturbed his position. With a graceful flourish he turned Republican, a matter of no greater difficulty than stepping from one cow pasture into another. He was still Baron de Blumenberg. He still had his money and his power. Even the Commune did not disturb him seriously. Knowing the bad finances of the Revolutionary Party, he, like Baron Rothschild, quickly donated $1 million in cash, and in exchange did much as he pleased. The Commune rarely had the courage of its opinion. In fact, the opinions of the Commune were still in dispute the day it perished. On the day of Courbet's visit, the Baron was putting himself into safety. There was great commotion in the house. 100 bronzes were being packed into boxes, 100 rugs and tapestries rolled up, 1,000 pieces of linen and lace folded into trunks. An endless stream of muffled vases, paintings, chairs, etc. issued from the portals below and found a place in huge vans. The driver's whip cracked and the objets d'art rushed off for their vacation. Madame de Blumenberg raced from room to room, gathered up her precious bibelots, superintended the shipping of her furs, her fans, her ostrich plumes. She carried under her arm a precious handbag bulging with jewels. She was a tiny, bird-like woman, trim and quick, with brilliant bird-like eyes and sudden, bird-like motions. She skipped around, hopped upstairs and down, and from garret to cellar there was not a crumb that escaped her. No servant in her employ had ever managed to subtract so much as a minute's worth of time or a centime's worth of property. She often used to say that if she were ruler of France the government would have been run on half its budget. There can be little doubt of that. Only it did not occur to her that as head of French finances her policy of strict economy would have reduced her husband to beggary. "I hate to leave this behind," he was saying later in the day when Courbet and his assistant had gone off with certain valuable gifts to the Louvre, and the house was almost emptied of its contents. "But I guess we can't take everything." He contemplated sadly the enormous aired piano of rosewood and ivory inlay. "Edmond, mon cher," his wife exclaimed in tones of exasperation, "can't I find something more useful to do? Of course we can't take that. No one else can either, though. Here, you two." She turned to a couple of aproned men. "This goes in that. Quick now. We haven't all day. Remember when I gave you this?" The Baron sighed. He lifted the lid, the inner surface of which showed a ship foundering in a violent storm, done in ivory and various natural woods, and surrounded by a scroll of leaves in which amorous mermaids were disporting. He sighed and tapped a key. In the empty Rumid emitted a plaintive note that hung trembling in the air. Edmund, she admonished. He caught her arm and pulled her over to the piano. Remember, he asked. Of course, she said, irritated. That marvelous, terrible shipwreck. He sighed again. How romantic you are. She sneered and attempted to free her arm. Don't, he pleaded. Don't go. After all, it was the only time in my life that you gave yourself to me. His voice broke a little with emotion. You'll remind me of it some other time. But he had passed his arm around her waist and restrained her. I'll always remember it. How can you among all the others? She teased. You know they mean nothing to me. Just the distraction of a busy man. You have been my only love. I have often wondered what it might have been like if you could have returned all my affection. Haven't I managed your house? And as for women to sleep with, you can have all you want for a couple of francs. Experienced girls, too, in their line. The only time, he mused half to himself and passed his free hand over the scene of the shipwreck. We all thought we were doomed. That awful storm, the rigging swept away, the hulk leaking in every joint, the captain and the crew in despair. And we too, certain that we were to die on that trip which was to have been our honeymoon. During the first days of the trip I had thought it was only maidenly modesty that had made you refuse to receive me. I was to learn better later. But with death in sight, you were kind enough to give yourself to me because it was my last wish. Ah, all these years of your coldness will not erase that one embrace. As for me, she said drily, I regret it to this day. Come, are you through reminiscing? How can you regret it? He asked, seeing that Sophie came of it. I shall never cease to wonder that life, and such joy in life as Sophie shows, could have come out of the embrace of two who thought they were about to die. All you think of is Sophie, she said, and of how much you hurt me that you conveniently forget. And all those dreadful months of seeing one's body bloated and knowing that the day is coming nearer and nearer when one must split oneself open. That is what you should have had as your share, for yours was all the pleasure. All I had was the pain. To think, the Baron continued, that from such a terrible experience, snatched from the very grave as it were, should have sprung our light-hearted Sophie, gay and insouciant as a linnet, with never a dark moment, never a thought of death. While we're on the subject of Sophie, the Baroness said, you might go have a talk with her. What's the trouble now? He complained, and regretfully turned down the lid. And the scene of the sinking ship, which commemorated the most poignant moment of his life, when death had turned itself miraculously into life. Another one of her follies. She wants to stay in Paris. Wants to stay in Paris? How ridiculous. Where would she stay? With Aunt Louise. What nonsense. Well, see what you can do with her. I've exhausted my art. The Baron traversed the great empty halls to his daughter's room. She was sitting on a bare bench at the window. When she heard her father enter, she looked up with a smile. Radiant, warm creature, he said to himself. Lucky the man who will have her for his wife. How she will love him. Lucky Beryl. The Baron was moved by a strange emotion that was not jealousy, for it was not painful, but it was related to jealousy. You have been having another quarrel with your mother, he said. Why no? What about? She just told me that you refused to come along with us. Well, I'm glad. That's settled. He was indeed glad. He was so genuinely fond of his wife and daughter that the slightest misunderstanding between them was enough to spoil the day for him. Of course it's settled, she said carelessly. I'm not going. I'm staying with Aunt Louise. But child, he expostulated, why didn't you say so before? We would all have stayed together. Why, we've moved every stick of furniture. Besides, I'll never be able to persuade your mother to change her plans. You know your mother. Now why can't you two ever agree? But Papa darling, you needn't change your plans. I'll be well taken care of at Aunt Louise's. Ah, I see, he smiled suddenly. Of course, why didn't I think of that? He's staying too, isn't he? She blushed and bit her lower lip. Yes, she answered. He's staying too. Lucky Beryl, the Baron had to think again. Yes, stay, he blessed them mentally. Stay, and a benediction on both of you. Give yourself, give your whole self to the man of your choice and make him happy, as I was happy only once in my life. The train of thought nearly brought tears to his eyes, and he felt impelled to sit down beside his daughter and put his arms around her. You don't remember when I used to take you from your nurse's arms and carry you around the room? Ah, you were the sweetest baby in the world. You wouldn't go to bed, you wouldn't eat, and you wouldn't do your little business unless I first gave you a ride around the nursery. Is it? How I wish I could do it now. She hid her annoyance and suffered his caresses for a moment. Then you will take care of Mama and make it good with her? She said, and took the occasion to free herself from his arms. He rose with a sigh. I'll see what I can do. The unpleasant prospect caused him to mop his brow. She jumped up and gave him a hug and a kiss. My good papa, she exclaimed. He left the room treading on a cloud. Just outside he met Beryl and impulsively wrung his hand. There's a surprise for you, he said. A big surprise. Go, Sophie is waiting to tell you. Beryl, who had seemed worried, looked up with relief. What kind of a surprise, sir? Sophie will tell you, the Baron insisted. It would not do, he thought, to deprive her of the joy of telling Beryl herself that she was going to stay in the city. Though Beryl had come to say goodbye, that had not been the chief cause of his worry. On the contrary, within the last 2 days he had come to feel rather pleased that Sophie was leaving, for in the face of the growing conviction that there was some truth, not much truth of course, to what all the men were repeating about Sophie, he could have imagined no better solution than her departure from Paris. That would put a stop to her friendship with this young guardsman. What might the surprise be? Beryl wondered. Perhaps she has decided to accept me when I ask her. The thought was almost too much for him. With his heart beating audibly, he knocked at her door. Sophie, he breathed as he entered, and could not say any more. They conversed in staccato sentences. Neither was at ease. Beryl was debating, should he drop to his knee? Should he speak out boldly? At last he determined to speak. Now that you are about to leave Paris, my dear Sophie, and I shall be remaining here, away from you, and occupied in dangerous work, there is something I should like to ask you. But I shan't be going, Beryl, she objected. His stream of language, which had been flowing so limpidly, ceased at once. Thrown over the tracks thus suddenly, he was for a moment completely at a loss. You don't seem pleased, she commented. He turned his head away and muttered, if I could be sure it was for me that you were staying. She had not heard him. What did you say, Beryl? I said, he summoned his courage. The men around the canteen are saying such ugly things about you. Really, she answered. What, for example? His courage petered out. Just ugly things, he concluded lamely. Of course, he added in great haste. I don't believe a word of it. But what? But I thought I'd tell you. I see, she said. There was a moment of silence. He squirmed, unsatisfied. Of course it's just gossip, he said, and awaited her confirmation. What's just gossip? What they say. But you haven't told me what they say, was her calm and altogether too sensible riposte. Nervously he pleaded. Tell me only that it isn't true. But she insisted, relentlessly. That what isn't true? Spurred on by some malicious spirit, she wanted him to bring the words to his lips. She craved the strange joy of hearing her love for Bertrand issue from his mouth. She would have that pleasure, at least, granting the impossibility of flaunting more intimate proof of her love before him. She had experienced a great many new sensations in these last weeks, and still she wanted more. Now that she had broken into a new world, she was insatiable for ever new joys. A great wave of pain passed through him. So it's true, he murmured. But how can it be true? He was a man who has run to the harbor and found the ship he was to take already far out to sea, and who now stands on the shore saying, over and over again, as if a lie well rubbed in could act as a balm to the hurt of truth. It can't be true. No, it can't possibly be true. And then anger rose in him. I know what I'll do, he declared. I'll kill him. I'll find out where he lives and kill him. Inspired by her cruelty, she encouraged. Find us some time when we're both together, and you can pierce us both with one thrust. Not you, he stuttered, all undone. But I'll kill him. That comes to the same thing, she said. For we two are only one, and if he dies, so do I. Very well, he said. Then you can die too, for I'll get him. So that's how much you love me, she sneered. That's how much your letters were worth? After all the times you swore undying love for me, and to think that I was taken in by those cheap promises. She turned her head away as if in disgust. He was thunderstruck. The boldness of her argument quite took his breath away. Her defection was pushed into the background. The question now was, had he lied in his letters or had he told the truth? Which? Thoroughly whipped, he whined. Then what am I to do? If your love was ever real, you will continue to love me, she answered. My love for him will never waver, I can tell you that. This was even more crazy than her first argument. But he accepted it. I'll always love you, he declared in a low voice. You are good, Beryl, she praised. And I shall continue to give you what I have always given you, my companionship. I never gave you more, never promised you more. And for my sake and the sake of your love, you will be kind to Bertrand and never say anything of this to father or mother, or Aunt Louise, or anybody. He gulped and promised. In a daze he found his way home. When he had taken off his uniform, he threw himself on his bed. But he felt very uncomfortable, and he did not want to sleep. What was it he wanted? Something was missing in the room. He looked around, his thoughts in strange confusion. Then he knew. His letter. He must write Sophie a letter. And he sat down and wrote of his love and her beauty, and his pain and anguish and his eternal fidelity. And early in the morning when he had posted his letter, he felt more his usual self. Captain Beryl de Montfort, disappointed in love, heartbroken, launched himself into his work with viciousness. The task of spying for the Versailles government was a delicate one. He found in its intricacies the necessary antidote to his misery. Moreover, if he could not, true to his promise, take direct vengeance on Bertrand or on those other gossiping guardsmen of the 204th Battalion, he could attack them from another side. And he was after their blood. The thought that they would suffer from his work spurred him on. These were the people whom his activity was going to destroy. But though he went at his task with great energy, he did not fall to protect himself from suspicion. For example, though as a member of the staff he could have secured valuable information at the staff meetings, he deliberately avoided being present and secured his knowledge elsewhere. In that way no one could think he was snooping. Cluseret, chief of staff, noticing de Montfort's absence from the meetings, accused him of negligence and threatened to have him dismissed. He was generally taken to be merely a light-hearted officer, interested more in his uniform and in making an effective appearance on horseback than in war. Several such stories are told of Courbet's willingness to prostitute his famous realism for money. For example, that a famous Mussulman employed him to do a woman realistically depicted in the act of love. In this painting, said to be still extant, all unimportant details such as head, limbs, hips, breasts, etc., were omitted as having no bearing on the central theme. Cluseret, famous soldier of fortune, fought under Garibaldi and later in the American Civil War on the side of the North. Lincoln promoted him to a generalship. He took part in the Franco-Prussian War and Commune, and being subsequently sentenced to death, he fled to Mexico, where he remained until the amnesty. He returned, entered politics and for some time served in the French legislature. He had talent as a painter,